Right, if you would, turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Chapter 7 here, we're going to focus on verses 8 through 17 today. And yeah, I've got a big chunk. We're trying to go a little faster. I told you I wanted to do all 40 verses in one setting when I started this, but we're taking in more manageable chunks. We're going to look at this. I want to remind you of our setting. It's important that you have that understanding as we go into this, because we're going to deal with a section here that I kind of warned you about that is extremely controversial today. As I told you, I try not to avoid that. I'm not going to give you a survey course to say here's the different options for you among Christian theologians, because I think the text is rather plain, but I do know that when I get done, not everybody may agree with me, but we're going to try to go after that today. But the setting is simply this. If you recall, Paul has received a letter. You can see that in the very first verse of chapter 7 there. Paul mentions this comment. He says, "Now about the matters that you wrote me." He's received a letter. Evidently, despite how bad this church is, and you remember Corinth is a problem, isn't it? Just about anything you could do wrong happened at Corinth. Any kind of sin you can think of, any kind of misconception about theology you can think of, it happened at Corinth. But there was evidently a body of believers there that wanted to get it right. They actually had an understanding that had been a change in their life. They wanted to get on the right side of this, and they knew they lived in a culture that was battling against it. Remember, we talked about Corinth when we started this book. Corinth was such a bad place in terms of the culture that the surrounding evil culture thought Corinth was so bad, they came up with a term. Remember that term? To Corinthianize. When something got so bad that it was beyond the pale that even immoral people thought this is too much, they called it to Corinthianize. You're acting like those Corinthians. Remember the city. The city's setting was that it was a town there in the isthmus of Greece there, and ships, rather than sail around the cape, would be rolled up onto land and rolled across to the other side to save hundreds of miles of sailing. And so Corinth became a place for the sailors, when they were have a little bit of downtime, to enjoy themselves. And what kind of industry grows up when you have a bunch of men who have been at sea for months and have not seen women forever?
Computer games.
Computer games, absolutely. So they had brothels, were a growing and massive business. Crime was off the charts there. As we said, even the religious groups that inhabited Corinth hired male and female prostitutes to have available. So the morality of the city as a whole was a mess. And this had crept into the church. In fact, it's quite possible that the people that wrote this letter to Paul that he mentions here in chapter 7 may be the same people at the beginning of chapter 5, where Paul says this: "It is actually reported there is sexual immorality among you, and of a kind that does not even occur among the pagans." It might be the same letter. It might be that these people said, we're so shocked by what's going on, we need to write Paul and see if we can find an answer to this problem. And so they have a list and goes, here's what we've come up with to solve the problem of immorality. Here's what we're going to do to be better Christians. That's their beginning point. Sounds good, doesn't it? Unfortunately, their solutions were in many ways worse than the problem. And that's why Paul has to begin. Now, last week we looked at this. Paul established something for us. I want to put this out to you. What Paul wanted to bring back was a high view of marriage. This is his beginning and foundation point. He said we need to have a high view of marriage. Now, that may seem odd. Why didn't Christians automatically? This is interesting to note. In the ancient world, it was considered by most of the pagans and Jews surrounding this that the Christians were homewreckers. They had a terrible record on marriage. Christians destroyed marriages. Now, where did such an idea come from?
Someone would get saved and a marriage would be broken up.
There you go. The Jews began this big part. If you remember the Jewish community, if you became a Christian, what was often done by the Jews that you're done. In fact, they often did this. They actually held a funeral. They held a funeral and said, this person is dead, they passed from us, and whatever bonds they had, whether they were children, husbands, wives, whatever, they were done. And they pretended they were dead, they were cut off from any kind of inheritance, they were done with the family. So Jews saw Christians as destructive to marriage. They're the ones breaking the marriage, but it's the Christians' fault. But here's the interesting thing. In the pagan culture, they had the same idea. Now here's an interesting one for you, and it's mostly because of women.
Women.
It's women's fault. Here it is. Anybody has thought of what was going on that made them think that Christianity was destructive to marriage, and you could see it in what happened to women?
Didn't like the husbands out playing around and girlfriends and stuff.
That was part of it. It changed the morality, and suddenly the thing that was an accepted norm of men, because there were two standards. Men could do it, women couldn't. Men could go outside the marriage, it was perfectly normal. So a changing morality, which was upsetting the men. Those uppity women coming up with standards for me. Who does he think she is? But there's another one that's even worse than that. I want you to try this. It was commonly held that a family made a decision based upon the man's choice of what their religious affiliation was going to be. What you did, how you worshiped, was for the father or husbands or the head of the household, the male, made that decision. Now, do you know something about our faith that doesn't fit into such an idea that, hey, I'm going to make this thing, and here we go. And our children and you are all going to be this kind of pagan. We're going to worship Artemis, and that's what's going to happen. And now you have to do it, the kids have to do it, all the family members. What's the problem with Christianity? It doesn't fit that model.
We only worship one God.
We only worship one God, but here's the other thing. It's not a community decision. It's an individual decision. And here's what we were destroying families. You know what? We were telling those uppity women they could make a decision on their own. They could actually choose which religion and what they believed. And it was destroying families.
They forgot about the Old Testament where don't marry those women because you're going to adopt their ways. It's been around before that.
It had been around. We had this problem. So having women see what you guys do.
Quiet in the church.
And you start this madness, and who knows where it's going to end. It'll lead to women getting an idea that morality matters. Next thing, they'll want the vote. You just don't know how this thing's going to go. Insanity ensues. And so Paul has to address this. He's trying to get back. We have to have a high view of marriage. This is where we're going to have this understanding. Despite our image out there, we have a high view of marriage. We're not the ones that want to destroy this thing. This is the idea. Understanding this, that God began this whole thing by saying that a marriage is a foundational element. Any culture that loses a high view of marriage is doomed. I'll put that out to you. That begins a trend down that is going to destroy things. It always has that impact. You cannot maintain any kind of long-term stability in a culture without a high view of marriage. So Paul begins with this understanding. And he does that because here were some of the things they come up with. Here's how we're going to solve the problem. Remember this from last week? They had two ideas. We'll solve this problem of immorality by making these two decisions. Here's decision number one. We'll promise never to marry again. This is what we're going to do. We're going to take a vow of chastity, and that's how you get over this sexual problem that's happening out there. People having these wild sexual activities. We'll just impose a vow of chastity on everybody. We'll all remain single, and that's going to solve our problem. Remember that? Paul says, probably not. Now, where do you think they got this idea that maybe chastity was the answer? That a vow of chastity, never marrying, was really, that's how you knew who the most spiritual people were.
That's right.
What's that?
From Paul's writings.
Paul.
He said, don't get married if you can control yourself.
Paul is single, isn't he? This is the most spiritual. He founded the church. Clearly, the most devoted people, the people serving God the best, are single. It's obvious from Paul. Now, remember what Paul's answer to that whole idea was? Oh, you don't remember last week? What did Paul say?
Works for me, but you don't have to follow.
Yeah, that's right. It works for me because God gave me a gift to do this. But he has a rule here. He put up something here, looking back at chapter 7, the first 7 verses. Now, in the matters you wrote about me, is good for a man not to marry. He's saying that is an option. Chastity, a vow, you could do that. You might be able to do that. But he makes this comment. But since there is so much immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. He says this. Imposing a vow on someone who isn't equipped to handle it doesn't make the problem go away. What does it do? It makes it worse. Probably not a good choice. And he's saying this, while it is true, and he goes on and says, I wish you were like me. The reality is, most of you aren't. So he says, as a basic rule, the reality is most people will get married, and most people should have a high view of marriage, and this is how you should start things. They had a second one. What if you're already married? Now you can't make a choice of chastity. What do you do now? We'll just make the chastity part, we'll just take that part out of marriage. We'll decide, you know what we're going to do. It's a spiritual, emotional, and physical union. We'll go for 2 out of 3. And we're just going to make that, and we'll make that vow in marriage. Now, how did Paul go after that one? How good an idea was that?
Not good.
Not a good idea again, because Paul said it is an obligation. There's an expectation that marriage is supposed to be all 3 of those things. So by imposing this kind of a rule on people, you're again going to make the problem worse. As a matter of fact, he even goes so far as to say this. Some of you are doing this. You're saying, you know, I'm going to devote myself to prayer. And therefore, we're going to cut that out. We're going to make it. And first he says, you know, first off, you can't make that decision by yourself. There's this uppity women thing again. That's not the guy's decision. He says this, if you're going to do that, it has to be by mutual consent. And then he also says this idea of prayer, it's not just prayer in general. Remember that we had the definite article. What did he say? If you're going to take time away from that for the prayer. Now, what did he mean by the prayer? What's he talking about there?
Whatever
The
season
specific
in your
issue.
life.
Yeah, a specific issue. There's something going on right now. You guys had to make a decision about moving. Maybe it's a financial thing. Maybe there's been a death in the family. There can be something where something is an all-consuming issue that's really just driving you to distraction, and you say, you know what, we need to pray about this. And the 2 people in the marriage say, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a time and devote ourselves to this until we find God's wisdom in making a decision. And then Paul says, once that decision is made, what should you do? Go back to normal. So first off, by mutual consent, and second, not for a long period of time. Again, these are not the answers. Now Paul is going to have to deal with another round of questions. We're still on this issue of marriage. He wants to go after this. And in the next section here, there's a whole new list of issues going on. Now I want to just give you an idea of the questions they're asking this time and the ideas that we have, and then we'll look at our text and read it and start to take it apart. Here's what some people did. You know what? I see what you're saying. It's crazy for a couple that are married to take a vow of chastity. They're used to that. How can you possibly stay in that household with that person you've been intimate with in the past? And how can you stay pure now? Here's our answer. If we're really going to do it, if we're really committed to this, the answer is simple. Any idea?
Divorce them.
Let's divorce them. You go your way, I'll go my way. We will dedicate ourselves to the Lord. What a great spiritual solution. That's how we'll find the answer. We know we can't keep a vow of chastity in the relationship, so we'll separate out on this thing, and that's how we'll solve the problem. And now we can be spiritual again.
Yeah.
They also had this question. Because you remember there's a tension. Remember the tension? There were 2 groups. Another group in the church had a very different idea about this marriage thing. Remember who they were? Jewish believers had a whole different take on this. We talked about this last week. Jewish believers said this. It's marriage. Here's one group that's saying no marriage is the solution to be pure. The Jews said this. It is a command to get married and a command to have children. And if you aren't doing both, you're in sin. Paul has to deal with this dichotomy, 2 groups at war with this whole thing. But here comes another one here. Here's what's commonly happening. One member of the household gets saved, and the other doesn't. No, you get saved, Dustin, not so much. What do we do? Because we know something. First off, there's a command, but Paul has preached before. You know what the command is? Do not be unequally yoked. You should not be married to an unbeliever. But you are. I mean, the guy is so boneheaded, he won't listen. You try to share with him, you try to talk to him, and now it's even worse. Think about this. You want to be devoted to the Lord, but you're the woman in the household, and he's the head of the house. And if he says you can't go, you know what? That's what it, I know you can't. Now you're either in rebellion or you don't go. You can't be down at the church doing things. And now you have these dudes there. This pagan influence. polluting your children's lives. You want to teach them the truth. You want to raise them in the truth of God. And he's got this other thing going on. We got attention. So what do we do now?
Cut him out.
Once again, the idea comes down to this. They believed that the answer was divorce. Obviously, you've got to get that influence out of your life so you can be devoted to God. It's clear. What other answer could there possibly be? This is what Paul has to answer here. In our section, Paul is going to look at 4 groups of people. He's going to look at single again. He's going to look at marriage where it's both people in the marriage are believers. He's going to look at a situation where you have one person who's a believer and they're married to a non-believer who wants to stay in the marriage. And you have the final group where you have a believer who's married to a non-believer and the non-believer wants to leave the marriage. And he's going to answer, well, here's how we handle all of these situations. Now let me read this through for you and then we'll take it apart and get a sense of what's happening here. Starting in verse 8. And mine says, therefore, or now, to the unmarried. Now he's going, therefore, it's based on this principle he just said. We have a high view of marriage. With this high view of marriage, he says, now, to the unmarried and the widows, I say it is good for them to stay unmarried as I am. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. To the married I give you this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and a husband must not divorce his wife. To the rest I say this, I, not the Lord. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer, and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer, and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife sanctified through her husband. Otherwise your children be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbeliever leaves, let him do so. A believing man or woman is not bound in such circumstances. God has called on us to live in peace. How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Nevertheless, each one should retain the place in the life of the Lord assigned to him, to which God has called him. This is a rule I lay down in all of the churches. Now there's our 4 groups and the 4 ways Paul is going to go after this and see if we can sort this out. And Paul starts again with this idea of singleness. Now he's expanding it here a little bit. You notice before he talked about people who had never been married. Now look who he talks about in verse 8. In verse 8 he says, now the unmarried and to the widows. He's got 2 groups here. Ones who have never been married, those that have been married. And he says to them, what is his command here? I give this command. He doesn't say a command, does he? I say it is good for them to stay unmarried even as I am. Now is that saying that's the best option?
No.
Is he saying that's the only option? What's he saying?
It's good.
It's an option. And it's a good option. Again, if they are what? Unmarried and gifted to handle it, to stay that way, even as I am, says Paul. And he goes into this whole thing of saying, if they have that, they could do that. Now, here's what Paul is trying to get at. And I think it's important that we get an understanding of this because I think we do some of the same things that were done in those days, especially by the Jewish people, this whole aspect of marriage. What do we tend to think if we see a young man or a young woman into their 30s who have not been married yet?
They're either spinsters or weird.
You know, there's obviously something's wrong. Something's off. I mean, I've been to what's wrong with that person? Why does no one want it? What's wrong with them? We assume it's a problem, don't we? And we push for that. I know parents often do this. They send their child to a 4-year Christian college. Not so much for the degree. You know why many Christian parents send them to the 4-year Christian college?
Shoe factory.
Yeah, just
Come in singles, patch up their soles, send them out in pairs.
leave as a pair, you betcha. And if you're getting toward that senior year and you're not dating anybody regularly, hey,
Let's go.
do you know how much this is costing me? Get out there and do what I ask you to do. Find a spouse. That's your job. I pay for the education. You find a spouse that I'm going to approve of. That's the deal. If not, maybe I'm going to charge you for these 4 years. And that's our approach. And Paul is saying, you know what? God does give some people to be single. Guess what? There's nothing wrong with that. They could be like Paul is. Then he mentions another group, widows or widowers. Do we tend to pressure them to get remarried? You know, I found they often do. People get that they've lost a wife and a little time has passed. We always want to be careful. We don't do too fast, but we'll start saying, you know, you had a relationship. You're probably going to be lonely. You really need to get back out there. You need to look into having another next relationship. A person who's had one good marriage can have another one. And we start pushing in that direction. And Paul again is saying, you know what? Just because they had one marriage doesn't mean they have to have a second. Some people figure, you know what? That was the marriage of my life. That's it. And a matter of fact, to be honest, in some cases, if that's the case, I don't know if I'd want to be the one coming back into it to be constantly compared to the last one that they put on a pedestal and thought was the greatest thing they would ever hit in the world. Do you really want to be in that comparison? You know, when I was married to Tim, he was fun. He did things. We went places. You just want to stay at home all the time. I got 5,000 games out there that my past husband got taken, and you don't use one of them. You don't even touch his pickleball paddle. And we have this attitude of comparison. And Paul is going, you know what? Leave them alone. This is an option. Some people will make that choice. Let them make that choice. Nothing is wrong here. Nothing is evil. We have no command from our Lord that says marriage is a necessity. Understand the command in Genesis. It was a command given to the humanity as a whole. And I'll tell you, do you think we've done okay on the be fruitful and multiply side of things? I think by and large, if there's one command God has gotten, I think we've done okay with that. It doesn't involve everybody. Also, people think that Paul is making a very personal appeal here. Now, as I told you this before, in all likelihood, Paul was married at one time. We don't talk about that. Paul never mentions it. But Paul was likely married at one time because he was a member of the Sanhedrin. And it was a rule that you could not become a member of the Sanhedrin if you were not married. Paul never mentions that wife. So what happened to her? Paul got saved and said, you know what, honey? Goodbye. I'm on the road for the Lord Jesus Christ. All right, or maybe I won't because I'll be writing this other stuff. Is that what Paul did? I doubt it. Not the way he talks about things here. There's two options to what may have happened to Paul's wife. Paul may have been widowed. It was not uncommon for women and men not to live that long. Death and childbirth, all kinds of diseases that went through. He may have lost that wife. And most commentators think he lost that wife before his conversion, because Paul never mentions a wife even during the time in which he was serving the Sanhedrin or persecuting Christians. What's the other option that may have happened to Paul? Try this. Remember what I told you happened to Jewish families? Now I want you to think, especially, who was the most hated Jew of all time?
Christ.
But number two, with a bullet working his way up the charts, Paul. Paul, why was he so hated? There was one, but they pursued him with a vengeance they never did for that fisherman Peter.
He was Jew among Jews.
That's right. This is a guy who was being trained to be the teacher in Israel. Gamaliel has picked him as his successor. This was going to be the next. And what a good choice. Guy had a Jewish education, he had a Greek education, may have been the intellect of his time, quite frankly. Paul was a genius. And it was figured that Paul was going to rise to that level. Paul was hated because it was bad enough that you lose some fishermen and some tax collectors and a few jerks like that who follow that Jesus guy, but not this guy. This is our best guy. And it is possible that the family of his wife said, you know what, Paul is dead, but we don't know. Whichever way it happened, But it's possible that Paul is making some personal application of this section because he knows intimately what happens when these things occur. Now, most people think what he's saying here, to the married I give this command, not I but the Lord, a wife must not separate her husband, but if she does, she must remain married, and so forth. He's talking all these things through because he probably lost his wife, and he's saying, it's not weird for me to be single. It's perfectly all right. Yes, I lost my wife. I don't have to get married again. It's possible he's making that kind of comparison here for that very reason, because it's something they would understand coming from him. It's also possible he's making this comparison because people might have been doing exactly what we do. You know, Peter's married. What's wrong with Paul? Why isn't this guy married? What's gone wrong there? And Paul is trying to make a point that that's not the issue. So this is the first group here. He's saying it is perfectly normal, nothing wrong with this. We can deal with this idea of being single. He goes on down through this. In fact, you can pop over here, look at starting in verse 25. He goes and expands it. Now about virgins, I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as one by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Now get this, Jesus did not command marriage. He's making a point here. Because of the present crisis, I think it is good for you to remain as you are. Are you married? Do not seek a divorce. Are you unmarried? Do not look for a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I would like to spare you that. The current crisis, Paul said, there's things going on. Well, why would Paul consider what kind of crisis is going on in Paul's time? What's he dealing with?
You're heading into the diaspora.
What's that?
You're heading into the persecution.
We're probably on the edge of a persecution. It hasn't been widespread, but Paul knows this much. Even though it hadn't gone through the entire empire, had Paul's life gone a little different than some of the other apostles, perhaps?
Yeah.
You think things were a bit intense for Paul? Remember Paul saying, you know, I've been night and a day on the open sea. I've been 3 times beaten with. He goes through this whole series. All these things have been happening to me. Now, I don't know about you, but that's one thing to happen to you. How would you feel if your wife and children were in the mission field with you and you wind up and have these things occur? So Paul's saying, you know what? When things are this bad, it can be easier not to have a wife.
And he probably saw Peter and others who were married having to balance these things.
And he even mentions, you know, I could have a wife along like Cephas does, mentioning Peter, but I don't. And yeah, it was a balance. I find it interesting that people point to this as one of the things, the Catholic Church loves this passage because they say, you see, there's problems when you have marriage. I don't know if you noticed, but back in the first 7 verses, he says there's problems if you don't get married. Here's something that I know is going to come as a shock to you. Life has problems. Regardless of your situation, life has issues. Life is going to have some challenges. There are challenges for those that try to take a vow of chastity when they're not equipped for it. There's going to be challenges to living with another person. Has anybody been married that didn't notice that there's some challenges to marriage?
Missed it.
I'm not going to call on anybody to say, tell me what they were. No, but there are issues there. There are concerns there. A relationship requires a certain amount of work. Paul says because a man is going to be concerned about the things of his wife, the wife's going to be concerned about the things of her husband. Is that necessarily a criticism? Or is that what you should be doing? Should a husband be worried about the things concerning his wife? Should she be focusing on things that are helpful to her husband?
Yeah.
I think so. These are part of living. I've had this. I appreciate that over the years, I like the fact that people have approached because they think, they see my wife and I, they feel we have a really good relationship. But I've had a number of young men who are looking to get married approach me and want to be counseled, and a number of married men that want to say, how do you have a better marriage? Young men come along and say, you know, I'm not called to be single, but I can't seem to find anybody. What do I do? And I mean, say, go to a Christian college. And that's where
Christian dating sites.
yeah, disintegrating dating places, all these things, here you go. Now, first off, a relationship is going to take work and it's going to take something. The first advice I've always given, quit looking for the right person and focus on being the right person. If you want a person of character in your life, first be a person of character. Have the kind of quality and the issue of spirituality that's going to be attractive to the right kind of person. God will sort that out, but start by doing that. If you're starting in a relationship, I always say, start doing right now what you're going to need to do your whole life. Treat that other person with the care and consideration of keeping a holy relationship. Treat her that way. Here's the problem. Most of us start that way in dating. And once we get married, we get complacent, we get out of touch with that thing. We stop doing that. But start that and keep this up. To married men, I've always had this challenge. If you want to have a marriage that's going to be the kind of marriage you want, that's be the grace of life that God called it, here's some advice that I think is very simple. You remember the things that, you may have heard of these. I know it's a past thing. It's called politeness and manners. There's a third word called chivalry. I may have to define these. I know they're out of touch in our culture.
Chiselry?
Yeah, chivalry. Chivalry.
That's when you're cold.
And I challenge men with this. You remember the old-fashioned idea that a man opened a door for a woman? That he'd just pull up with a car, would you get in? We gotta go. Or if he's really, really kind, he'll lean across the front seat and go. There was an old adage, I know back when we wore hats, and we don't much anymore. You know what a man did when in the presence of a woman? He took the hat off. Try this one. A man is seated at a table and a woman enters the room. You know what he used to do? He stood up. Why did he do these things? Respect. And I've always challenged men with this one. Okay, are those in the Bible? Does anybody see where taking your hat off, opening a car door? That would certainly not be, but the chariot door is in the Bible? No, it's not. But I'll challenge you with this. If you don't want to use the traditional things in our culture, what are you doing on a constant basis that says to a woman, I recognize your importance in my life and I respect and care about you? Because gentlemen, there's a critical thing here. We stop reminding the woman we supposedly love that we love and cherish and hold her in high regard. And if you don't want to use those things, my challenge to men is this. If you don't want to use the old-fashioned things, what are you going to do to replace that in your relationship? Because it does two things. First one, it reminds the woman that you care about her. It is a constant thing that says, I recognize your importance in my life. And I'm doing this every day and all through our marriage, whether it's 5 years or 100, I'm going to do this because it reminds you that I recognize your importance to me. But here's the other thing, gentlemen, it does. It reminds you of her importance to you. It compels you to think in terms of that gift that should be cherished in your life. It changes your thinking. And if you get out of the habit of doing it, you stop thinking of her that way. I've also put this out to men. Never use demeaning nicknames or comments for your wife. I hate this one. That's my old lady. I detest that because it doesn't sound respectful and it doesn't put her in a good light to the people you're talking to. Remember this one from the 1950s and 60s? The old ball and chain.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's a loving comment. Let me introduce you to the old ball and chain. That really elevates her to people. Make a habit of speaking highly of her in front of other people. And here's it, especially when she's not there. Because that's where we get out of the practice. And I'll tell you, you get no more points than this, that someone meets your wife and says, the way your husband talks about you is just incredible. When she hears that you praise her and lift her up out of her presence is huge. Paul is saying there's problems, absolutely. But the relationship takes effort. I'll put this out, this may sound corny to you. I start shopping for Christmas, birthday, and anniversary gifts right away. When my anniversary is passed or a birthday is passed, I am the next day thinking about the gift. Now you think, well, God, yeah, you're buying her love. No, it isn't about the money, it's this. I have a family member that does all of his Christmas shopping Christmas Eve, and he's just panicked. He's both. And what do you do when you're doing all your shopping at the last minute?
Buy the first thing you see.
First thing you see, whether it matches or has anything to say. I try to show that even if it's not an expensive item, and frequently through our lives it couldn't be, that the item was something that recognized what she liked. That she thinks back, goes, I remember that conversation when I told him I like that. It's months later, he remembered. You know what that does?
Shows attention, love.
But it shows an attitude that says, I thought about what you said, I watched when we were shopping, what you touched and what you remembered, and I know what you like and don't like. Again, these are small things. But when Paul says it's a challenge, yes, it is, but we make it so much more of a challenge than we have to. So much more of a challenge than we have to. But Paul says in the current distress, the things going, single might be an option for you. What's the next group? Now here's where it gets controversial, so stay with me. To the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord. Now notice, remember how we determined that? He is saying, it's not making a difference between, this is my opinion and this is what God said. What's he doing?
That's nice authority.
This is a revelation you've already heard, but when I speak, this is new revelation that you haven't heard. Is there a difference in authority between the two? No, there's not. Jesus gave his apostles the authority to speak to these issues. And Paul is going, in this case, I shouldn't have to remind you of it. You all know Jesus' opinion on marriage. Remember Jesus' opinion on marriage? We did the Sermon on the Mount together. Remember his statement on that?
I hate divorce.
That's from Malachi. I hate divorce. But Jesus was really plain about this because divorce was common in the Jewish community. They even came up with a list of reasons you could use. You burn a meal, grounds for divorce. Try this one. They got so far into it, they said this, if he found a woman more pleasing to the eye than her,
Oh.
yeah, that was grounds for divorce.
I'll put out his eyes.
These were attitudes, but Jesus made it very plain, no. And he only made one exception in the Sermon on the Mount. Only one. Remember what that exception was?
A hard heart.
Except for the case of marital infidelity. When there is fornication, when there's adultery, when she has sexually gone out or he has sexually gone outside the marriage, I will allow for divorce and remarriage in that case. I'll point to that. It's in Matthew 5, but it also is in Matthew 19. God, he repeated it just so you make sure you didn't misunderstand it. Remember the Matthew 19? Remember what he was talking about marriage here? Remember the apostles' response when he told them about how he viewed marriage? It's better than marriage. This is crazy. I can't just dump her for any reason. This is madness. Here you go. Matthew 19. Now, where do I want to go? Yes. He says all these things. You want to be perfect, sell your possessions. He talks all these things and starts going down here, but disciples said, yes, a situation between a man and a woman. Start verse 7. Why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? You know what they're going on? He's saying marriage is supposed to be permanent. And he says, you know what? If it was so permanent, why did Moses give us a command? There must be grounds. So he goes on. Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. Guess this. He's saying it wasn't because of the reason you thought. It wasn't because the wife was no longer meeting the standard. Who was no longer meeting the standard? You weren't. He gave you reasons because you were stupid. And you kept being stupid. And here we go. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for marital unfaithfulness, and marries another woman commits adultery. And that's what the disciples said to him, if this is the situation between a husband and a wife, it's better not to marry. I just can't get out of this whenever I feel like it. Now, I've had some people tell me, well, it says you can divorce, but you can never remarry. But what's the context here? He says it's sin if a man divorces his wife and remarries, and she has to, except in the case of what? Adultery. In that case, a divorce and a remarriage are permitted. Now, that's the first thing, but I've had people say, no, just divorce, but not remarriage. Well, I'm sorry, the passage context is pretty clear. But now he comes back over here and he's saying the same thing in our passage. He's going, you've heard this before. Might have come to you that there's this whole thing, and he says, to the married I give this command, a wife must not separate from her husband, and if she does, she must remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband. Now, husbands are all at this point going, absolutely. Because in that culture, the wife was the only one that didn't have that right. Yep, there you go, sorry. But what does Paul immediately follow that with? And a husband must not divorce his wife. Well, that's not fair. I was down with this when it was the woman. But now you're going to make it this dual thing again? Won't you try? That's pretty strong. So his first thing is this. Here's a high view of marriage. If there are no grounds, and Jesus only gave you the one, what are you doing? Here's his challenge to them. Your suggestion is that to be more spiritual, I'm going to divorce, which is a direct contradiction to what our Lord commanded. So you're saying that to be more spiritual, I'm going to ignore the commands of our Lord. Disconnect here. Furthermore, he's got this one. You're asking me this question, and you know what Jesus said. Did you really think I was going to come in here and go, you're right. Jesus got that one all wrong. Here's my opinion. Let's go this way. You really think I'm going to overturn that? That's your thinking? We're not going there, he says. So that's his first one. To the rest I say, I and not the Lord. Now, what do we know immediately? Jesus didn't speak to this. Here's Paul saying, there is an issue Jesus didn't speak to that we have to address. And what is that issue? Saved person with an unsaved. What do we do with this one? If any brother has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. Well, but we have that command about unequally yoked. What are you going to do with that? Now we have a contradiction. Which one's the statement that's true? Well, they're both true. If you are going into a marriage as a believer, don't marry an unbeliever. If you're in a marriage and become a believer, now what do? Remember what we started this whole thing with? We have a high view of marriage. And marriage overrides what you want in your comfort zone. Is that going to be a problem for people? Yeah, I hope it shall. The most important thing in your life you can't share with the closest person in your life. That's hard, isn't it? I can understand the desire to get out of that. Paul's saying that's not going to work. But then the argument comes back, but again, he's polluting the whole relationship. What's he going to do to our children? How's he messing up my spirituality? Here's what Paul comes back with. The most influential person in the relationship is not the unbeliever. That's what he says here. For the unbelieving husband, in verse 14, is sanctified through his wife. Well, great. He just gets saved automatically because of you. You show up at the gates of heaven and go, I've got a pass for two. Yeah, it's your plus one. You had the invitation from God. This is so easy. Is that what he's saying? Okay, what does he mean by sanctified then?
To change him.
Here's the power of it. Quit worrying about his pagan activity changing you and think about the power of God changing him. You are in this relationship. The power of God can impact him in ways that if you're not there will not happen. Now, I've known women, especially in cases that have waited decades to see that happen. And I know some where it never happened. But he's saying this. Your goal is to impact him. And I want you to think about this. Isn't that how Christianity works anyway? Are we ever the majority in this world?
No.
Do we ever have a situation where we can make sure we only surround ourselves with Christian people? No. We're constantly influencing an ungodly world. That's what we're here for. I love that whole thing where there's the debate going back with Abraham and God. Remember on Sodom? You know, how about it if I find 45? No? 20? Yeah, and what did God say? Every time he offered a new number, what did God say? If I can find that many, what we'll do? I'll spare them. If there's that much of an influence, if you can find me 45, if you can find me 20, if you can find me 10, we'll go with that. And I'll say that we will, for those righteous people, that influence is more important than me judging the city. What was the problem? Couldn't find one. Now I want you to think about that. They couldn't find even one. He spared Abraham's relative there out of kindness, not because that was a godly man. But now he's coming down to this. If just a few people could have made that, do you understand the distinction you being in that relationship and remaining in it can make in that person's life and in the children's lives? It says they're holy. God is putting special, there's a spillover effect. There always has been. Us being in the world always causes a spillover effect of God's mercy in the world. Us being here. I know the world does not want to say that right now. They do not want to admit that. But our presence causes the blessings of God to spill over on them.
The world's always interested in having the benefits of godly living, but don't ever want to admit it.
No, they don't. But he goes down through this. To the rest I say this, I not the Lord, if a brother has a wife who is not a believer, verse 12, and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer and is willing to live with him, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her husband. Otherwise your children be unclean, but as they are holy. There's an impact there. Now we get controversial. Here comes the next setting. But if the unbeliever leaves, let him do so. A believing man or woman is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to live in peace. Well, now we have another situation. The believer, the unbeliever in the marriage, the unbeliever wants out. They want to walk away. And what does Paul say here? Let them go. Why?
Peace.
For peace. A contentious divorce ends your influence in their lives. If they see an attitude in you, can you still have an influence even if they've left the relationship? The character that he's looking for says you need to show a character seeking peace, seeking their best, even if they're... And understand, this could be hard, especially for a man walking out on a woman in that culture. That could be devastating financially. But he's saying, let them go. And then he makes this comment, and here's where it gets controversial. In this case, they are not bound. What does he mean by that?
They're not obligated to the relationship, to the contract.
Okay. Again, I've heard this. You can let them go, but you cannot remarry.
It doesn't say that.
Okay. Notice the contrast. In verse 10, to the married I give this command, I must not separate from her husband. If she does, she must remain unmarried, or else the reconciled husband, and a husband must not divorce his wife. We're looking at these two things, and I'll make a comparison. I want you to understand. I think we have Paul introducing the only other case in which a Christian can remarry without committing sin. Where an unbelieving spouse has left the relationship. And is it a reality that often in divorce, it doesn't take both parties to want it? Anybody ever heard of a situation where the one spouse said, I don't want this to happen. I'm not looking for this to happen. And are you given a choice at times? Not even close. But he's saying not bound. I think the only translation here that makes sense is that in this particular case, Paul is saying, here a person can remarry without committing sin. Verse 16, you saw that. How do you know, wife, or who will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, who will save your wife? Nevertheless, each of you should remain in the place in life that the Lord assigned to him, to which God has called him. I'll put in with this. Remember we talked about this, that in the Roman world there were a lot of different ways to get married? There was slave marriages, right, which weren't recognized legally. They were just the permission of the owner. There were common law in situations where people took up residence, they didn't have a means to have a legal paper documents drawn up. There was purchase marriages where a guy could go and just buy a daughter from some guy and say, I'm gonna provide this much money and she's gonna be married to me. And then you had the big thing with the cake and the ring and all the veils and everything, the big production wedding. Here's what Paul is saying: no matter how you got there, that's not the issue. What is the issue? God has a high view of marriage. And you will honor that and you will stay in it as long as you were allowed. And the only thing that's going to change that is that an unbeliever won't allow the marriage to stand. They walk away. Now that leaves us with one question. What happens when you know that there are Christians that have gotten divorced and remarried? What do we do about that? Break up the new marriage and send them back to their old spouse? You can't unscramble the egg, can you? Is there any sin you can remember that Jesus didn't say he could forgive and restore? So what's the starting point? Admitting that the action, whatever time it happened in your past, was a sin. It wasn't God bringing you the love of your life. It wasn't because God wanted that to happen. It was sin regardless of how it occurred. And now we move on. Questions or comments? Like I said, controversial. And I will let you know there are people in the church right here teaching that will not agree with me on this, that